Hello, and welcome to Lindamood-Bell's Leaders in Literacy. This is our next in our webinar series. The title of this presentation is Effective Comprehension Instruction Through Content Standards. I'm Tom Mendoza. I'm the co-director of Lindamood-Bell for Schools. And this presentation is going to be appropriate for anybody who has been trained in our visualizing and verbalizing program, or is actually using it in the classroom, but it's also going to be appropriate for anybody that is interested in learning effective comprehension strategies in the classroom. Our mission at Lindamood-Bell is to help all students read and comprehend to their potential. And we believe passionately about that, including students with disabilities such as dyslexia and autism. We can do that, and we verified that through an approach that we call sensory cognitive functions. And specifically, that's developing brain-based skills as a foundation for language and literacy skills. I am honored today to present our guest leaders in literacy. We've had the honor to work with a number of school districts across the country doing professional development and implementing our programs in the classroom. And so I would like to go ahead and introduce our panel today. First, we'll start with Kellen Ross, who is from Monte Vista School District in Colorado. Welcome, Kellen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Next, we have Kathy Ewing from Fort Smith Public Schools in Arkansas. Hello, Kathy.
Hey, everybody.
And we have Ashley Morelli, who joins us from Pinellas County Schools in Florida.
Hello.
Welcome. And last but not least, Carla Mathis, also from Fort Smith Public Schools in Arkansas.
Hello. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Carla. And I'm really excited to have them present. They're going to be talking about best practices in comprehension instruction, specifically with our visualizing and verbalizing program. Before they get into that, I do want to provide a brief overview of our approach and how we implement our programs throughout the curriculum. When we started working with schools over 30 years ago, we had some essential questions about how we can take our approach and apply it. One was, what is a primary cause of weak language and literacy skills? Why were some students successful with the curriculum and others weren't? Secondly, was there an instructional solution for those struggling readers or students with disabilities? Could we scale up interventions, in other words, to get them over the hump and have them perform at proficiency in the classroom? And then could we provide an instructional model and deliver that and sustain that over time? And those continue to be our driving questions in our partnerships with schools. Specifically, our approach focuses on what we call sensory cognitive factors, and think of those as brain-based processes that underlie reading and language comprehension. So we know, for example, that phonemic awareness and symbol imagery, what we call symbol imagery, think of that as orthographic processing, orthographic mapping. We know that those skills are necessary for fluent decoding and spelling skills. And we know that instructional techniques that ignore that approach will not be effective for many learners. Similarly, we also, through our research and case studies, we understand the role of what we call concept imagery as a foundation for language comprehension. Concept imagery simply being your ability to create an imaged gestalt or whole for oral and written language. And so that's the primary brain processes that we focus on in our instructional process. Now, think of the component parts of reading as an integration of different skills. So we know if you focus on these inner circles first, we know that you have to have strong phonological processing and word attack skills. And then you have to map those sounds to letters for fluent decoding on the page. We also know that receptive vocabulary is important as you're reading in context. So putting all of those component parts together. And again, those inner circles focus on decoding skills. Now, if I spend a lot of time working on interventions, developing those decoding skills, I can develop reading skills quite well for many learners. Yet we know that many learners, even despite good phonological awareness, good spelling, good decoding skills, struggle with language comprehension. Think of those inner circles as subsets to a greater whole. We decode to get meaning. And so even though you may have well-developed decoding skills, that does not guarantee comprehension. So in our approach, we primarily focus on the role of what we call the imagery language connection, and specifically two types of imagery, one being symbol imagery, as I alluded to earlier, and that's simply being able to create a mental representation for the sounds and letters in words, and that's going to underlie decoding fluency. And concept imagery for oral and written language comprehension. And that will be our primary focus area here. So what does that look like? We focus on developing an imaged gestalt or a whole for language. Think about the proverbial in one ear and out the other. We make fun of it. You talk about, oh, that joke was over his head, or the language just went in one ear and out the other, and they didn't quite grasp it. But it's a real thing. If you think about it, what's happening from a brain-based process that allows individuals to hold on to language, whether it's written language or oral language. And the idea is that as language comes in, their brain has to do something with it. It has to hold on to that. And what we found is being able to create an image gestalt, or making a picture in your mind, or a movie in your head. That allows you to hold on to that language. Imagery then becomes sensory information that holds on to that language and prevents it from going in one ear and out the other. And why is that important? Well, if I'm only getting parts and details, I'm not going to be able to think critically about the information I'm listening to or reading. If I'm only getting parts and details, I can't answer the question, well, what was that mainly about? Because I'm going to answer with a specific detail that really isn't the gist of the whole thing. I also won't be able to draw a logical conclusion, again, because I don't have the gestalt or the imaged whole or the main idea, so I can't conclude logically what's going to happen next, or why something happened. And making an inference, predicting and extending information, or evaluating information, all of these great higher order thinking skills and strategies are going to be for naught if I don't have the main thing imaged in my mind. We sometimes call this process-based education, and that allows us to assess individual students in the moment, assess how are they in terms of their ability to image text, for example, or what they just heard in a lecture. And then we can use that formative assessment process to develop that specific skill, in this case, imagery or visualization, and ultimately apply that imagery language foundation for each student to content standards. And that's where we are here now in this presentation. And it's important, and we do this with our visualizing and verbalizing program. That's important because, as many of you know, it can be easy to develop specific skills and habits in an intervention, whether it be phonemic awareness or comprehension strategies. It sometimes can be easy to develop those skills and habits, but often we don't see a transfer of those skills and habits over to the curriculum. So in that intervention period, or in those activities that students are performing in their interventions, you'll see some nice growth. But oftentimes it doesn't transfer. And that's why this is important, and what you're going to hear in this presentation. You'll also see that these good strategies will supplement other comprehension activities that you might be using in other interventions or other programs, and you'll see a nice supplement to that. We know that in this case, it is the difference in closing the achievement gap for your struggling students and certainly at-risk students, where other good strategies, again, may not be sufficient because it's not at a foundational level. And so what does this look like in the classroom? How can we take, for those of you who have used visualizing and verbalizing and are using the steps and are familiar with it, and also those of you who might be new to the program, what does that look like in terms of applying the strategy of the imagery language connection, applying it in the classroom, applying it through the curriculum? So with that, again, it's my pleasure to welcome our guest leaders. And I would like to first introduce Kellen Ross. And Kellyn will introduce herself, tell a little bit about what she's been doing in her district in Colorado. And Kellyn, I know that one of the questions that we often get is, well, how do I take a strategy and apply it to content standards, to whether they're your state standards, Common Core standards? How can I explicitly take the strategies and apply it to all the material and standards we were responsible for? So I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit about your experience in Monte Vista.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Kellen Ross. I am the instructional coach for the Monte Vista School District, K-12. Before I became the instructional coach, I actually had several years as a special education teacher for elementary. That's where I had my first experience with Lindamood-Bell. In, I believe it was 2013, 2014, our special education team was trained with Seeing Stars and VV, and from there, our school really kind of took it on. We moved towards whole class Lindamood-Bell, and we really use it in lots of different formats within our buildings right now. So as an instructional coach, my position is a little bit different, and while I'm not doing the direct day-to-day with students, I am helping teachers implement VV strategies, things like that, and trying to dig into standards and how we can address some of the things that we've seen come up in our district that we know we need to do a little bit better at. So I'll start with testing, actually. Educators don't like testing. We need it. We appreciate the value of it. We know it's, it has its purpose. But it's definitely not one of our favorite things to do. Definitely not one of our kids' favorite things to do. But what we started to notice over the past couple years is that our students, while we felt like in activities and groups, we felt like we could see their comprehension building and them being able to apply things. When it came to a testing setting, they were struggling to interpret the question itself and then determining how to answer that. So we decided to kind of attack that using VV, since that's a process that we've used to build those comprehension skills. So we started using RAP as a supplement. Some of you may have used that if you're in education right now. RAP stands for restate, answer, and prove. So when we give students a comprehension question, we're teaching them how to systematically break that down using some of our VV language and figure out, what is it asking me to do? What did I picture in the story? And what did I picture to help me prove my answer? So those are kind of some of the steps that I'm going to take you through. And I do have, I pulled up an example from Common Lit, just to kind of give you an idea of how we approach it, especially at the 4th and 5th grade levels. Okay, so this is an example from Common Lit that we have used with our students. It's called Baseball's Girl Umpire. So what we did is our teachers would break this down. This one we read paragraph by paragraph in a couple of parts. There were a couple areas that were pretty heavy with some vocabulary, so we broke those down and did multiple sentences and asked kids to picture as we go. What did you see for this? How would you picture? There's a line in there about how the male umpires would have insults thrown at them. And so that's an area we would really talk about with kids. Well, what do you visualize for that? What do you see happening during that time? Because a lot of students, especially struggling comprehenders, would take that in a very literal way. So we need to make sure that they're able to see those different components and picture those and have some true understanding before we ask them to respond to comprehension questions. So if you can go ahead and go back to that slide for me. So one of the comprehension questions for this one specifically was, how was Amanda treated as an umpire in comparison to male umpires? So this is a type of question, it's open-ended. We would want students to reply in writing using a RAP response. So we want them to restate, we want them to answer, and we want them to prove it using something from the text. So I gave an example there. It's a little bit wordy. You can tell it was written by a teacher and not necessarily a student. But this is kind of how we would model that component for them. So restating, in comparison to male umpires, we took part of that question, restated that, made sure that we pictured what that meant. Amanda was treated with lots of excitement because she was the first female umpire. And mind you, all of this, the RAP piece is not happening until you've had lots of discussion and really some deep understanding about what we saw happen in the story and what is this comprehension question asking us. So then in order to prove that, paragraph 10, kids have to go back into the text and find it. They can verbalize talking with their partners or a small group, however you want to set that up in your classroom. What did we picture for that? What did we picture in paragraph 10? This alludes back to the male umpires would have bottles and insults thrown at them. Yet Amanda received calm and polite responses. So as we worked through the common lit passage with the different VV steps, we were creating all those pictures as we went. When we come to the comprehension question, we talk about what is it really asking us to do. Once students have that picture, it's much easier to provide a response and be able to prove their answer because they've already created that picture in their head. And what we wanted to make sure happens, when we first started with VV, when students would come to Lindamood-Bell groups, they would know to use those kinds of responses and to picture things in their head. But then if they went back to class and we said, well, what did you picture for? And they're like, oh, I wasn't picturing when you were reading that because that's a Lindamood-Bell thing. We knew we had to make that transfer for kids and start using that language all over the place so that it just became part of their process, part of their problem solving. So that's kind of what led us to this point. I have one more example. So another area in our district that we have found VV to be very supportive is math. When we first started using it with reading, we're like, oh my gosh, these kids are, when I ask them what they picture for that word, they're really able to tell me that. Then we get into a story problem in math and they're looking at us like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So we started using that same language to help them break down story problems because that's one of the most challenging things for kids to do. They may be able to do the math, but trying to interpret a problem very much in a way like the comprehension questions from the story earlier, you have to know what it's asking. And I think that's one of our biggest takeaways. So in first grade, there was just there's a sample word problem there for you. Bonnie found 6 rocks on her sidewalk, 5 more rocks in her backyard. How many rocks did Bonnie find? So before we threw that question at them, we would definitely talk about important vocabulary. What do you picture for more? Because mind you, these are 6-year-olds. They may not know what more means. Sometimes providing visuals for these guys, obviously we would want to do a lot of hands-on work as well, help build up their confidence level before you can make the transfer to just creating the pictures. But then in these word problems, especially at the first grade level, we typically use sentence by sentence, start real slow, really talk about what they're picturing. We do a lot of partner, share, pair, work in groups, that kinds of things. So as we're breaking down this word problem, we're having students picture what they see. What do they see for 5? What does that mean to them? Share with their partners, maybe draw out a picture to help themselves hang on to that visual. Obviously, as they get older, they don't need to draw those components out as much, but it definitely is a scaffold for young learners to help them breach the visualization with something concrete. Then as you work through the problem, what do you picture for adding 5 more? Now that we know what more means, what do we picture happening? So really it is about, for us, we have used VV to help our students learn, answer questions of all kinds. It's a strategy we've tried to build some independence with, so that when they're approaching a state test or something like that, they're not as overwhelmed by a question that has 3 or 4 sentences in it, because they know, okay, I'm going to look at this, just the first sentence. I'm going to break this down for myself. So we try really hard starting in kindergarten to give them exposure and practice with all of those components. We also use RAP in math as well, because we do want students to be able to explain how they've gotten their answers. And so that all lends itself back to that visualization. We've been pretty successful with it. Our teachers use the language pretty fluently in the classroom in different areas. And I feel like it's definitely been a benefit for our students.
Thanks so much, Kellen. I love that example of when they were asked, well, what do you picture for that? And they said, well, wait a minute, we don't do that here. We do that in our intervention VV group. And I think that's a great example of that transfer skill that you talked about there. And, for those maybe not familiar with visualizing and verbalizing, a strategy in terms of helping students understand what they're reading, just changing your language, as you pointed out. How are you picturing that? And even just adding that little bit of language in your interaction can go a long way. Thank you. Next, I would like to introduce again Kathy Ewing from Fort Smith Public Schools. And Kathy, I know when I'm teaching a VV workshop, I often will hear how the strategies really nicely support effective writing instruction. So I think in your role at a high school level and talking about writing, I'm really excited to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, I am Kathy Ewing, and I do teach at Bell Point in Fort Smith Public Schools, and I teach 9 through 12 language arts. So we do, obviously, I teach reading and writing standards, but I did want to kind of talk to you guys about how I do note-taking, specifically using VV strategies. And I made sure I was very intentional with my passages that I decided to show you guys today. I wanted to show you some informational text instead of fictional text, because I feel like just talking to coworkers in my district, everybody said, oh, well, you're an English teacher. VV is easy for you to incorporate. I heard that a ton. And so I kind of wanted to show how it can be incorporated in science and history too, with informational text instead of just a narrative. So I kind of created this set of notes through Google Slides, and each slide is a different color, and it's to tie back into those colored felt squares that we used in VV, so the kids can kind of here I pictured, right? So the first slide, I didn't share every single slide with you guys, but the first slide is just a very simple title page where they would put the title of the article or the story that we had read, along with their name and any group members' names. And then the second slide would be all about vocabulary. And so that's where I think all of us are probably going to talk to you about how important it is to pre-read as the teacher and pick out which words we think our students don't have images for. And that's where we would go ahead and we would do pick to pick. Or we would really kind of think about okay, so here's this word. I might give them a definition, and then I would ask them, okay, so what do you picture for that? When's a time that you might see this word pop up? So that was always really good. And then once we got our vocabulary done, that's where I would also have decided, am I going to do this as a whole class? Am I going to do this partner reading or individually? And of course, we started with whole class, and then we ended up leading into partners. So the idea is I would read a section from the text. And sometimes that was sentence by sentence. Sometimes it was paragraph, a whole paragraph at a time. But especially because I focus on that language of we're creating pictures in our minds, or I flat out say I want you guys to make a movie in your mind. So I started using scene by scene, which isn't technically LMB vocabulary. But it really worked for my kids because sometimes, you have to break a paragraph into multiple pieces, or sometimes you might have 2 or 3 very small paragraphs that really go together and they help build an image. So we would stop at commercial breaks for our notes a lot of times. So here I do have, this was over a project that we did. It was an argument essay that they had to write where they were doing research on the effects of solitary confinement on an individual. And so this came from one of our psychology articles that we read. And you can kind of see like the white box is the text, and then the blue would have been their slides, their notes. So this is the here I pictured. And what I liked about this, again, this is very sciencey to me, but the kids, we read through that passage, and then what we ended up picturing, I would call out to the students and ask them, like, okay, so what do you guys picture for that? If it was silent, if I heard crickets, I'd start going back to my structure words, right? So what sounds, what colors, what sizes, what emotions did you guys kind of pick up on? So that helped us build this. So you kind of have like, here I pictured the outline of a human body with a clock inside of it, and the body is outside in the sun. So it was just really cool how the kids were able to kind of like take these scientific terms like circadian rhythms and figure out how they were going to take notes on that. Here, there was a section they had to read, and they turned it into a pie chart. Like as they were reading it, they were picturing pie charts in their mind. So that like pulled back into science and math, some different terms that they normally don't see in an English classroom. And so they pictured in this one, like a pie chart, and the top of the pie chart says 80,000 people. And they talked about how it was cut into 3 equal pieces. So I just thought that was really neat, how like that's how they would picture it. And I would even get down to, like, okay, so what color was this piece of your pie chart? If you see like on my notes, I have a section here I pictured, and that's their picture summary for what we read. But I also have a section that says keywords. And honestly, I'm still playing with that and figuring out what I like best for that. Sometimes it's a quote from the text that they wanted to use in their argument essay. Like they knew they wanted to go back and quote the author here. Sometimes it would be picture cues or keywords. So they could just flip through and see the keywords, and that would be enough to remind them of what was on that slide. So it just kind of depends. A few times it was words that maybe I didn't catch to begin with that they needed for vocabulary, and they would add those words in for keywords. So honestly, I'm still kind of making this work for me. It's something new that I started. But that's kind of how I do my notes with VV in mind. Here's another example. This was talking about the hippocampus and how studies found that the hippocampus in individuals in solitary confinement would shrink, and what the hippocampus is responsible for. And I really liked this one. This was from my boy Levi, and he like had this full description when he was talking to us in class about like there was this outline of a person's face, and you couldn't even tell if it was male or female. And you could see a drawing of a brain like inside the face, and there was this teal oval inside the brain, and that's your hippocampus. And inside the teal oval, there was a map, an SD card, and a pros and cons list. And then like as the oval starts shrinking, like you see tears falling down the person's face. And that went back to the text about how the hippocampus was responsible for memory, for geographic orientation, and then also for decision making. So he like saw this little like teal oval inside a brain, and it had an SD card for memory. And I just thought that was really cool. And again, I feel like that is a really good description of how you can use this in science. It's not just something for English. So I also, one of the big things for me with VV, and it was something I did not expect at all, was how much incorporating VV and even seeing stars really, really changed how my children would write. So I did start using it in just teaching writing, but also in my peer reviews. So here's an example of a peer review checklist, and it's just a section of it. But I always have a checklist for my students when they peer review for someone. And I started including a lot of the VV language in there. So did they use details so I could picture what they were talking about? I think that really helped my students a lot. A lot of times when your students are doing a peer review, they don't catch mistakes from their peers because it's the same kind of mistakes that they would be making. And this was a nicer way of saying, like, did what they say make sense? Were you confused by them? So basically, like, could you picture what they were talking about? And you can't see it, but at the top, it's like needs improvement, good, and then flawless. So that's like their little check marks that they can do. And then I always have them do, I liked, like I make them compliment their peers. And then I wondered about, that's like their questions, like their suggestions. But also I included, I could create better pictures if. So if I'm reading a peer's paper, I would tell them, I could have created better pictures if you would have given me more descriptions on size, or if whatever, if you would have explained this concept better. I also wanted them to, again, compliment their peers, just because a lot of my students, I am at an alternative learning environment, and they have very, very low self-esteem when it comes to academics. And so I'm always forcing them to compliment each other. And so I was like, what was their best structure word? So in their writing, what was something that they were really, really good at describing so I could picture it well? And then which structure word do they need more help with? So that's one of the things that I did for my peer reviews, and it's really made a huge impact on the kind of feedback they're giving each other. And so then how they can kind of fix their own papers. And when we get into that process of editing and revising, I do a lot of SI for editing, like, oh, this word is misspelled. Like, what do you picture when you hear this word? But then we use a ton of VV when it comes to revisions, when it comes to like, what additions do I need to make to this paragraph? Or what do I need to take away? Maybe I put too many descriptions in and I lost my point. People got confused by me. So yeah, those are kind of my big takeaways from VV in my classroom.
Thanks, Kathy. I loved the example, and I hadn't thought about it before. Just the peer review process in there really lends itself nicely to obviously helping the student become more detailed using their pictures, their imagery, but then their peer mentor, their person that's that are reviewing that, it also gets them thinking about, after reading it and giving feedback, how could they enhance that with more detail. So I hadn't thought about that, and what a great application of that in the writing process. So thank you for sharing that. Another great strategy. Really appreciate that. And next we have Ashley Morelli. Ashley, I know that also a big challenge, especially for struggling students, is when they get into really abstract content like science. I was really interested in hearing some of the examples that you spoke of earlier about how really you're just using the strategies throughout any content area, but in particular anything that involves really abstract kind of content and language. So with that, I'd like to introduce and welcome you again.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Ashley Morelli. I teach in Pinellas County in Florida. I teach third grade at Alyssa Nelson Elementary. I teach students who either have a disability of dyslexia or reading difficulty, or different characteristics of dyslexia or a specific learning disability. So I have been using VV for about 2 years now. Our Center for Literacy, all of our teachers are trained in seeing stars and visualizing and verbalizing. And like mentioned, I am going to talk a little bit about how I've embedded visualizing and verbalizing in math and science. And just as the fabulous presenters before me talked about how we've used the structure words and the vocabulary to really help make the students' pictures concrete. So my first example is going to be talking about how I use visualizing and verbalizing in math. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see a word problem here. I didn't lay it out the best, but the word problem says, Kayla will use a liter carton to fill her small fish tank. Estimate how many liters of water the fish tank can hold when full. So the first question I always ask when we're reading a word problem is, what is the what, or what is this problem about? So what do you picture for the what? And that's that first structure word that the students are understanding that that is the main idea, that after we've used that term throughout the whole year, they understand that is what they need to be focusing on. What is the what of this problem? What is the main idea of this problem? So it helps to pull in the structure words and tie in that vocabulary throughout the whole day. So we're trying to picture what is the what, or what are we trying to figure out for the problem? And then we're going in and I'm asking, well, what do you picture for the small fish tank? And going around and asking different students to show me what they picture with their hands. They can either show me with their hands, and then the students go around the room and I ask them to match their picture. So we don't have one fish tank and one medium and one small. We're all matching each other's pictures, which helps the students to grasp kind of a more concrete picture for what they're reading. And again, I try to call on different students to add to each other's pictures and then match each other's pictures so we're all on the same page. And going through and using those structure words to help. Again, the problem may be different. We may need to talk about the size, trying to pull in the vocabulary. So preloading and talking about what do you picture for estimating and liters. And once we have that, once you've created a picture for those terms, that can lend itself to drawing a picture and having the students work out the problem. So that really helps to talk about it, picture it in your mind, and then go ahead and lend yourself to drawing it out and solving the problem. We'll go to the next slide and we'll talk about, again, how I was embedding science into visualizing and verbalizing into science, and how I've also kind of embedded this science standards with the ELA standards while using the sentence by sentence imaging and higher order thinking. So for our Center for Literacy, we spend 2 hours a day in Seeing Stars intervention. So along with still teaching all of the standards, reading, science, math, writing, all of the standards. So time is of the essence for us. So we have had to become very creative with how we are going to teach all of the standards. So one of our goals, and this is our second year at our school, so we're still learning this and trying to figure it out. But one of our goals is to embed our ELA standards with our science standards. So what we've done is we've taken different science articles from ReadWorks or Common Lit or I'm drawing a blank on the other one that we use right now, but I like to go to ReadWorks a lot. And we've taken the science topics and then paired them with ELA standards. And that lends itself naturally to visualizing and verbalizing sentence by sentence, whole paragraph, multi-paragraph. So the example that I'm going to talk to you about today is one article that we read about exploring space with telescopes from ReadWorks. And what I've done is we went through paragraph by paragraph using the felts that were mentioned before, and having the students picture paragraph by paragraph as we're reading. But before I did that, again, as mentioned before, preloading and pulling out the vocabulary. So one of the words that we pulled out was astronomer. And I asked the students, well, what do you picture for an astronomer? And then we went back in the text and we talked about how, that's a scientist who studies the sky and observes the night sky. And pulling that into cause and effect, talking about how Galileo discovered the telescope, created the telescope, and then observed the planet Saturn and the Milky Way. But as we're going through that, we're using the felts to really pull into each paragraph. Well, what do you picture for the red felt or the blue felt? And having the students use their strategies to tell me what they pictured for each of the felts, and then also tying in the cause and effect for Galileo and discovering the telescope and then moving forward. So going through a science article like that provides scaffolding for the students who need it and gives the students an opportunity to feel successful when they're reading through an article that's 2 or 3 pages long in smaller chunks, and being able to have them feel successful with matching their pictures to a felt and remembering that they pictured this when they went back to the blue felt. And it just helps the students feel successful, because I think with our students they haven't felt always successful with reading. So it helps provide a more concrete representation. one of the things that I wanted to talk about with you was the structure word. And this is something that you can take right away back to your classroom. The structure words are really helpful for providing a writing scaffold and just to get the students going with describing and writing descriptions and having the students get familiar with writing descriptions and having them practice describing other items. So what we've done in the classroom is we've taken the structure words, put them on the wall, and then had the students, it's just a fun activity, have the students find something in the classroom or they can pull out and they need to use the structure words to describe it. And they don't tell the students what the item is, and then the students are able to guess using their pictures. So they're having this, the students will just read what they wrote using the structure words, and the other students have to kind of guess to their picture. So it's been interesting because when we first started at the beginning of the year, it was very difficult for the students to describe using only the structure words. And they weren't making enough pictures for the other students to guess. So now they've kind of gotten used to it, and now they're pulling their structure words into their writing and naturally describing items that helps them to pull it into their writing all the time.
That's great, Ashley. And I think the example of scaffolding in particular, especially for your struggling students and those where the content just doesn't come naturally, that's a great example. And following the steps, for those of you who are using visualizing and verbalizing regularly, even just following the steps, but applied in your content. So using the colored squares or those felts to sequence and anchor the specific images. That scaffolding, I think, is so important for recall and, again, organizationally getting it in the right sequence. So that was a great example. And I appreciate that. Appreciate your work. It sounds, I'd love to come visit the center that you're working in soon. It sounds like a great place. Lastly, we have Carla, also from Fort Smith Public Schools. And I know as getting into the upper elementary and middle school grades, writing becomes more important. And so all of you, I think, have given some good examples of writing. And so, Carla, I know for you, you're at a point with your sixth graders now where you're really trying to refine some of those writing strategies. So welcome again.
Thank you. I'm Carla Mathis. I, of course, teach sixth grade English language arts. I'm at Beard Elementary in Fort Smith. And I actually started with VV 2 years ago. I saw that the district was using, had some offerings for PD, and I chose to go through it just because of the fact that I had seen so much growth in the students that were getting it during the intervention time. And so because of that, I wanted to see if the students in my classroom could benefit from that as well. So that's how I got involved in VV to begin with. Now all of our teachers are trained in VV 3.6, and we're seeing so much growth with it. So I wanted to start with, of course, with writing. And writing has, when I first started going through the training, I immediately saw, oh my gosh, these structure words, they're going to be great for teaching writing. You need to add this to your curriculum. And so I did. I started using it not only with my comprehension with the reading, but I also started using it with my writing. And those structure words really helped the kids add those details and create that visual picture in the mind. It also we use it during the mentor text. When I share a mentor text, we're analyzing through that idea of the structure words and discussing what those pictures in their heads look like. And we're using that sentence by sentence strategy and going sentence by sentence through the writing to see what does it make the reader picture as they read it. Because we always talk about that movie, just like Kathy did. And the kids are like, well, I see this, but they never really had a picture in their head. And so this really and truly has given them that chance to have that picture. Having those vivid pictures helps students to add that more detail into their writing. And they can reflect also during peer editing. If someone else reads this, what would that make that same picture that I have? How would they do that? And so that has really been beneficial for the kids to be able to see and do. I had a group of students that were talking about a runt. They were talking about a wolf pup in a story that had that was avoiding getting sprayed by a skunk. And his litter mates had been messing with it, but he was disappointed to be left out. Well, the sentence said the pups were playing with a skunk, but Runt stayed away and didn't get sprayed. While that sentence was fine, the kids realized that if they added vocabulary words just like taunted and disappointed and made that sentence, the pups were taunting a skunk, but a disappointed Runt stayed away and didn't get sprayed, the kids are like, I have such a better picture of what that looks like now because of just adding those two visual vocabulary words. So having the students, able to visualize that, I mean, it's just huge. In reading, we have vocabulary, and everyone else has talked about adding vocabulary into recognizing words and noticing them more. I started with, just using the picture cards, and they're like, they're sixth grade. Mathis, why in the world are you doing this? But for me, it was all about getting them used to that format, and using those picture cards really helped with that. It helped them to go to that gestalt with that main idea and focusing in on that. And that's what reading is all about. What's the main idea of that passage? What are they looking for? So using those pictures really helped in the beginning. And what I found interesting was my students that were in those small groups that were getting that intervention, they shined in that VV process when I was just doing that picture card, because they were able to spit that out. Oh, I picture this. So I picture this. Oh, I see this in that picture. But the other kids, they didn't see it the same way as those kids that have had that visualizing and verbalizing. So those kids actually shined. And it just warmed my heart to be able to see those kids for once over these readers that are, reading above grade level and able to comprehend, but they were the ones actually being able to share those pictures and know what was in their minds that they were seeing. I quickly started seeing those strong readers struggling because they didn't have that picture in their head. Kellyn had talked about that, and Kathy talked about that. They didn't have a picture in their head when they read. And now they do have those pictures in their heads. They do read. And when I was just doing the VV section in one, they didn't get it. It was like they said, they didn't apply it to that whole process of reading when they were reading independently. Now they are doing that. They are able to not only just see a synonym and find that synonym in the actual vocab, but they're using that actual vocabulary word. After I'm going into instruction, I think about, okay, so how is this going to look? And one of my coaches told me a great way to incorporate this just into the instructions. He says, after you give your instructions, have the kids tell them whether they're picturing to complete during that independent time. So if they are having to go to Google Classroom and click on the link to take them to their assignment, they have to literally tell me those steps. What are you picturing in order to complete this activity? And the kids just remember every step. They remember what they're supposed to do. And it's great reinforcement for them to see that this is also being applied during that. I have a little bit of a different viewpoint on this. I have two children that are getting VV in small group intervention. And I can see, they're opposite. One's in sixth grade and one's in fifth grade. But they are totally different, as in my youngest, he's putting so much detail into his writing. He's just writing and writing and writing. But then my oldest son, he doesn't put as much detail into that writing. But now he has started using that larger vocabulary words and using words like taunting and recognizing when other people are using it as well, and conquering and anticipating. And so while he's built a lot of vocabulary quicker, he's really able to start adding that into his writing as well. And it really, as a teacher, it's wonderful. But when you see your child using it as well, it's great, and it shows that it really is working. And it makes me want to just use it that much more. So making sure that, using VV, students begin to create those pictures. It's important for them to read rather than the memorization. And that's what the VV strategies using and doing for the students. It's teaching them to not just read words and memorize text, but it's also teaching them to create those pictures in their heads of their reading. And that's going to help them in their secondary classes when they get to 7th grade and beyond, in American history and biology and world physics and things like that. So
thanks, Carla. And I think a lot of the themes that you were talking about reminded all of us that one of the things you learn in visualizing and verbalizing is don't assume imagery. And that's what I heard a lot with your examples is, don't assume that they have a picture for a specific piece, even if they're 6th graders, even if they're high school students, Kathy, or any age level. We work with adults as well, but that idea of I'm going to check to see if they have a picture for that. Otherwise, they're going to miss a lot of the other detail that maybe follows. So that was a really great example, a good strategy to really embed in throughout. I do want to thank all of you. The content here were just wonderful examples. We do encourage anyone to reach out to us either by phone or by email address with any questions. If you want to connect with any of the presenters and share ideas or get tips and strategies, that sort of thing. So we definitely encourage you to follow up with us with any questions. You will also find some great resources in our toolkit for educators that has videos and instructional tips, research, and that can be found on our website. And so I definitely encourage you to check that out, and hopefully you find some additional information. Again, to all of you, thank you so much to our guest leaders for sharing your tips for instruction and really for your ongoing work in making a difference for students. We really appreciate it. Thank you.